Welcome to the New Books Network.
Hi, everyone, and welcome back to the New Books Network Animal Studies channel. My name's Kyle Johansson, and I'm a host on this channel. Today, I'm very happy to be interviewing Hope Bohanec. Hope is the executive director of Compassionate Living and host of the Hope for the Animals podcast. Today, we'll be discussing her edited book, The Humane Hoax, Essays Exposing the Myth of Happy Meat, Humane Dairy, and Ethical Eggs. This book was published in 2023 by Lantern Publishing and Media. Welcome to the podcast, Hope.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, thanks so much for being here. It's great to talk to you. Before we get into the content of the book, I was hoping that you would tell us a bit about yourself, such as where you're from, the work you do, or just anything else you think listeners might want to know about you.
Sure. So I lived most of my adult life in Sonoma County, California, but I recently moved to Eugene, Oregon, not that far north, but a bit north of Sonoma County. So I'm in the Pacific Northwest. I've been vegan for 35 years, and I've been doing this work, environmental and animal rights work, for about that time, for 3 decades. I've worked for national nonprofits, in defense of animals, United Poultry Concerns, and about 3 years ago, I started my own organization, Compassionate Living, so that I could focus in on my own specialties. And one of which is the Humane Hoax, the Humane Hoax Project. And I've written 2 books on that subject, and that's what we're going to talk about today.
Yeah, great, thanks. Before we get into stuff, I'll mention that one thing that I was kind of impressed with was just how much um, this book that we're about to cover is integrated into the rest of your advocacy. So I know you have a broader project, the Humane Hoax Project, and it's really pretty multifaceted. Like, so you've got like the Humane Hoax online conference that you do annually. I think you've done it 5 times now. And there's a webinar you do, the Humane Hoax Chicken webinar.
Yep.
And you have a podcast, and your podcast, I mean, maybe I guess it covers a variety of topics, but it does seem to cover a lot of stuff that's very relevant to the book. Do
Yep.
you want to talk about any of these things that are part of the broader project?
Well, you absolutely right. I have the Humane Hoax Project that's through my nonprofit Compassionate Living. And so the book is just one component of the larger project. And yeah, we have our webinars. We've done now, I think, 7 or 8 webinars in the last 4 or 5 years, focused on this topic. And we have our website, humanehoax.org. We were really lucky to get that URL. We love that, humanehoax.org. So you can check that out. We have great articles on there, and it's a collaborative effort along with other organizations. And we have a vibrant volunteer base and volunteer a group that meets, and we do different projects and campaigns around the issue.
Okay, great. Well, let's talk about the book then. So, why did you decide to edit this book?
Yeah, so I've been researching this issue that I call the humane hoax. Others have called it the humane myth or humane washing. I've been looking into it for about 20 years now. And, back in the 90s, you really didn't see the labels that we're seeing today. You saw labels maybe like fresh or young. They used to put young on meat labels, just say that the animals was killed young. So different, very different labels back then. But so, I was seeing this progression to more labels like cage free or free range, right? Because of activists, vegans becoming more vocal and about the horrors that the animals endure in animal agriculture. So people were starting to become more aware, right? This kind of transition was happening to awareness of what the industry was doing, whether it be antibiotic use or environmental impact or other issues. People were starting to question the animal farming sector. And so we were making progress, and the clever marketers were responding, and these new labels were coming out. And these labels, of course, were meant to appease and reassure consumers that things were improving. And I thought this was a very interesting area to focus on and start researching. So I did that for my first book, The Ultimate Betrayal. And that has been out for about a decade now. It was the first book that was ever published on humane washing. And since that time, this issue has really just grown as far as commercially. I mean, there are so many more of these labels, so many more of these products available. And also it's resonating with activists and vegans, seeing this kind of trajectory, seeing these labels grow, and now people are really starting to speak out and speak up in many different areas of animal advocacy. And so I decided to do a follow-up anthology, to write a second book, but have this one be broader, and have numerous voices. From we have there's 18 contributing authors. I wrote the introduction and the conclusion and a chapter of my own, but there's 18 contributing authors so it's really a collaborative effort. There's activists, academics, rescuers, sanctuary workers. There's chapters by Carol Adams and Robert Grillo, Joanne Kong, Christopher Soul Eubanks, the late Karen Davis. So many amazing voices in a variety of different aspects of this nonprofit work. And so the entire project, of course, is called The Humane Hoax, like I said, through my nonprofit Compassionate Living. But this book really was a continuation of my first book that broadens the issue, and brings in many, many voices and aspects of it.
Okay, right. Thanks. Yeah. It's an impressive book. There are some very well-known people who've contributed to it, and the sort of overall level of education is impressive too. I think I saw the honorific PhD or doctor attached to maybe half the authors or something like that.
Yeah.
The people in this who've contributed to the book know what they're talking about. Yeah, so I mean, we'll move on in a sec, but there's this. I guess you've already said that this is kind of like second. I don't know if the right word is second generation modern animal rights activism, but it is kind of generational because, like you said, the problem you're addressing is something that was partly created by first generation modern or contemporary animal rights activism, and and you're responding to that problem. So there's something very kind of like fresh about the book, I guess. I
Yeah.
find that interesting. Like
Yeah.
you. Anyway, do you want to speak? I don't know if you want to speak to what I just said.
Well, yeah, I mean, I agree with you. I think that it's really our 21st century
Yeah.
problem, right? Because we did a really good job, pre 2000s, of exposing the horrors of industrial and factory farming, and all of that, and people really responded. People don't want to see animals hurt, and so they this issue became prevalent. But then this shift happened, and so now the marketers, the animal agriculture industry has lots of money, billions of dollars going into marketing, and they're coming up with all of this new labels and language and images on the websites and all of that now is what we've got to kind of switch the narrative, right, and show that all animal farming has inherent cruelties. And we'll probably get into that, but it's really, I believe, our 21st century activism. We've got to shift the narrative to talking about these labels and how they're not what people think they are.
Mm-hmm. Right. Okay, thanks. Well, so in addition to being your book's name, the humane hoax is also the name of a concept that's discussed throughout your book, the book's central concept, I guess. I was hoping you would just explain the concept to us.
Yeah. So I guess a quick definition of the humane hoax would be the new labeling and marketing of animal products that conveys this false sense that there's some improvement in the industry, right? Either ethically or environmentally. So greenwashing, humane washing is all the humane hoax. In a larger sense, I think it can be broken down into three areas: humane washing, which is the labels, the ethics, the lived experience of the animals, and does it change with these labels? And then the second part, I think, would be greenwashing and the environmental aspect, because we're seeing labels like sustainable and regenerative grazing and things like that fall under an environmental. segment. So that would be also under the humane hoax. And then a third area would be kind of backyard, do-it-yourself homesteading that is becoming very popular, keeping chickens for eggs, for instance, or even actually slaughtering animals yourself in the backyard through small-scale operations. So I think that is also part of the humane hoax. And so, really, to produce a profitable product for the industry, going back to the larger industry, the well being of the animal is going to be compromised in fundamental ways, no matter how. No matter how humane an operation even wants to be, right? There's these inherent cruelties, these certain practices that are universal to making a product profitable now in the modern way of animal farming. There's body mutilations, separation of families, slaughter at a young age. These things don't change no matter the label. And that's what I found when I did my investigation, when I dug in and did the research. But the industry, it really likes to focus on things that they can do, which usually is around the size of the confinement of the animals. And a really popular example is cage-free eggs, right? Getting the birds out of battery cages. And the battery cages, of course, were horrible, stacking the birds on top of one another in these tiny, tight, awful cages. And so that, of course, we want to get the birds out of those cages. So cage-free is very popular right now, cage-free eggs. And it's actually estimated to be 70% of the US egg market by 2027, cage-free eggs. But the size of the confinement is not the only cruelty that they face, right? It's not the only horror of the animal's life, but all the welfare focus gets funneled through this one lens, the size of the confinement, and all the other considerations just become invisible. And so I think everyone, of course, can agree we want to get the birds out of the cages, but the reality is that they still face so many welfare concerns, so many awful things, even though the issue is funneled through this one thing, the cage, and now it's kind of seemingly resolved when you buy cage-free eggs, right? So the perception of the cage-free label is that everything's better and that the birds are living a stress-free life, right? But that is not the reality. The label is misleading. From the beginning of their lives to the end, there are cruelties beyond the cage. And that's now hidden behind the cage-free label. And unsuspecting consumers think that, the birds are living a great life, which is it's far from the truth. So that's just one example. So we've really got to educate on what these labels truly mean. And that's why I edited the book.
Mm-hmm. Okay, right. Thanks. Yeah, I mean, and it came out in your answer that the concept your book's about, this humane hoax idea, is a pretty multifaceted one.
Yeah.
I guess two facets that interested me when I was reading it was, I think that there's a very kind of strongly empirical facet to the concept, but there's also something else that's more, I don't know if the right word is philosophical or theoretical or conceptual. I think one of the things the book is saying, and it's really important, is that the lives that animals are living on smaller farms are not as good as Animal Ag would have us believe, that they're marketing these lives as good lives, but that just empirically speaking, if you just look at the facts of their lives and compare those facts to the facts of the lives of animals in larger farms, the animals on smaller farms are often living really bad lives. And so you want, part of what you want to say is just this, make this empirical claim about the quality of life that animals are living on smaller farms. But there's also a conceptual claim, right? So I think part of the idea here was that sort of aside from these the very nuanced empirical details discussed throughout the book, there's something incoherent about the idea that we could be humanely treating animals, or be giving animals humane lives, or have a humane attitude towards them or whatever, and yet also be commodifying them and killing them. If you just that idea that it's humane to commodify, that it could be humane to commodify and kill animals, is just an incoherent idea because humane treatment is about compassion, and there's no way that you can compassionately kill animals or compassionately commodify them. Like, this is just nonsense. And so it struck me that, like, it is, these are two kind of different claims. Like, the conceptual claim and the empirical claim are a bit different from each other, but they're both important.
Yeah.
And yeah, they're worth distinguishing and sort of both appreciating, or something like that. Anyways, yeah. I don't know if you have any thoughts about
Well, yeah,
about
I mean,
that.
you're
Yeah.
absolutely right. And, it's, I think that people are concerned, right? They want to not be complicit or helping hurt animals. Nobody wants to hurt animals. So they want to, buy these labels. They look for these labels because they don't want to be part of harming animals. But ultimately, what is the worst harm that a being could face? Being killed, your ultimate demise, right? I mean, that is the existential threat that every animal feels, and you cannot say that is exclusive to humans. Animals, wild animals, fish, everybody, they struggle for life. They struggle against anything that's harmful, anything that's going to hurt them or kill them. So yeah, ultimately, nobody wants to die. No animal, no human animal or a non-human animal wants to die. So that's it, and in our legal system, actually, in our human legal system, we have this, progression of offenses. And usually in most legal systems around the world, what is the worst thing that you can do? You can take another's life. Another person's life is the worst thing, right? Murder is the worst thing that we could do. Well, when we think about it in speciesist terms, we don't want to be speciesist, right? We don't want to, speciesism being that you have this false sense that one species is dominant over or more important than another. And of course, we have that right now, dominating our culture. But what I think animal advocacy and what I and others and vegans are proposing is that animals' lives, they are their own. They do not want to die, and it is not, not right to kill them. So the ultimately, ultimately the progression, right, of the humane labeling is that we should not kill these animals. How can you have happy meat? How can you have humane flesh of animals? It's a cognitive dissonance. It makes no sense if we take into account that the worst transgression that you can do to another is killing them, right? So yeah, there's a lot of contradiction going on there.
So, listen, in your book, and this is a long question, but in your book, you and some of the other contributors distinguish between three types of harm done to animals within smaller scale farms. The first would be harms that replace and are less bad than some of the harms done in industrial farms. The second would be harms that smaller scale farms and industrial farms have in common. And the third would be harms that are specific to smaller scale farms, but which don't replace and are thus additional to the harms that are done in industrial farms. Complicated question, I know, but I was hoping that you would explain the relationship between these categories and humane washing. And I was also hoping that you would give us some examples of harms that fall under the different categories that you distinguish.
Yeah. All right. Well, let's start with the harms that humane labeled or smaller scale and conventional or larger scale have in common. And I'll say here, I'll say humanely labeled instead of small scale versus large scale, because the humane, with the humane hoax, people assume that with the humane label, it's a smaller farm, which is not necessarily the truth. And we can talk more about that later, perhaps. But just an example is Butterball turkey. It is the largest U.S. producer of turkey meat. in the whole of the United States, and they use the American Certified Humane label on all their products. So we're talking about, you know, hundreds of thousands to billions of turkeys, all with the Certified Humane label. So Big Ag uses the humane hoax as well. But the harms that they have in common are really multiple, and these, basically these operations are predominantly the same. There are painful body mutilations like debeaking, castration, dehorning. Now, I'm talking about across the board, really, with almost any operation that you find, no matter the label. They're going to have these, just a host of violating and terrible things that they endure and do to their bodies without anesthesia. There's also separation of families. Chicks are hatched in, they're not hatched in warm nests with a mother hen, as should be, as you would think, as nature intended. They're coming into this world in metal drawers, being immediately and violently tossed around like canned goods on conveyor belts. Baby calves are torn from their mothers at birth. So, and that can cause psychological distress both to the babies and the mothers. They all go to the same frightening slaughter at a very young age. None of that changes. All of that are those inherent cruelties that I talked about earlier. Those universal practices that are baked in to making an animal product profitable today, that they just kind of can't avoid. They have to do to make the product profitable. Making changes to any of these practices would make the product too expensive. They just wouldn't make money. So there's a lot that they have in common. There's a lot that goes on across the board, no matter the label. Now, moving into the second part of your question, and that is, what slight improvements or slight differences might be happening under these labels. And that often has to do with confinement. And that's where the industry does have a little wiggle room where they can give the animals a bit more space. And so they, will use that as so-called improvements like cage-free eggs that I talked about earlier as well. Instead of the chickens being confined in small cages, now they're on these floor systems that are basically just one large cage, one large building where thousands of birds are crammed in to a floor, and the change is minimal. They're still having, they still live with the waste burning their eyes and throats, never feeling the sun on their wings, all go to a brutal slaughter at a very young age. So all of that is the same. And there's even studies that show that there's higher rates of mortality in cage-free farming. So more birds die before slaughter in cage-free farming. I witnessed just horrible conditions in cage-free farms when I was researching for my first book that just shocked me. These birds were living, horrifying conditions in free range as well. So anyway, the labels are so industry friendly. And like the example I gave earlier with butterball turkey, most of what is required under that label is already happening across the board. Like they'll say things like having access to food and water. Well, okay, they all do. They're fattening them up for slaughter. That's not one of the myriad of cruelties they face. But space is something that they may be working with. And under the American Certified Humane label, the turkeys do have a bit more space, right? A bit more what's called the stocking density will be less, so fewer birds per building to have a bit more space. However, these turkeys still don't have access to the outside. They're still debeaked and detoed. Turkeys have their toes cut off at a very young age because of, if turkeys feel threatened, if they're frightened, they'll use their talons to defend themselves. And with the crowded conditions and the insensitivity of the workers tossing them about, the turkeys will lash out. The turkeys or other turkeys and workers could get hurt. So without anesthesia, they'll cut the first or second digit of the toes off of these birds when they're very young. It's very painful. Sometimes they can have lifelong crippling pain and limping around, unable to walk properly. So And that's all happening under this American Certified Humane label. The only thing that's needed to award this label is a few more inches of space per bird. So just, i- i- it's and while of course it's good to give them more space, that shouldn't be the only thing that's required, right, to be able to label a product humane. So that's, that again, there are some improvements in some areas, but it's certainly not what people think when they look at a humane label. And finally, the third part of your question was, what are possible unique harms or new harms with these labels? And there are, and that was the part that was shocking to me when I did the research. I went into this research thinking that I was going to be saying things like, well, free range is better, but going vegan's best, or cage free is better, but going vegan's best. No, that's not what I found. I found that there were certain situations where the labels were even worse, both ethically and environmentally. Uh, some examples, where it's worse for the animals: organic dairy, free ranging of pigs, and I can get into the details if you like. Free ranging is worse for the environment too, certainly. Free ranging animals, we have to clear land for them, cutting down trees, filling in wetlands, slashing green spaces. These are naturally sequestering carbon areas, and then putting animals there. It's not the direction we should be going in, so that can be worse as well. But I'll just pause to see if you want, if you'd like, I could get into one of the examples of like why it's worse for the animals, like organic dairy.
Mhm.
Um,
I mean, I think that would be helpful because this was one of the most interesting claims probably made in the book with respect to humane washing, that um, there are actually some harms that animals who are sort of slotted under these humane labels have to deal with that are entirely specific to those humane labels. Animals in industrial farms don't have to deal with that stuff, and that's
yeah.
so I was just I thought that was one of the most interesting things in the book. So if you want to say more, I'd be happy to hear about it.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting because you would think that either the labels are just neutral, like that it's, whatever, it's a lie, nothing's different, or it's slightly better. But I found that in certain instances it actually can be worse, and there can be new unique problems that come from the changes for these labels. And one example is organic dairy. So in the dairy industry, the cows are tightly confined, and the females are impregnated very young, artificially inseminated. They are pregnant every year of their life, which is not natural for their bodies. It's very, very stressful, both physically and psychologically, because all those babies are taken away. So it's not uncommon for dairy cows to be sick. And one of the infections that they get is called mastitis. It's an infection of the udder. It's very common in dairy, where the udder can swell. There can be open sores, very painful at milking. And so, what the farmers do in conventional farming is that they give them antibiotics and pharmaceuticals and all kinds of medications to clear up the mastitis and other ailments and illnesses. Well, I had veterinarians confide in me that what they were seeing in the dairy industry was really shocking to them, that now they were seeing cows on organic dairies that where the organic standards weren't allowing the farmers or them to get the vets to give the animals antibiotics or medications, anything like that, because it would pass through into the milk, and the human consumer would drink it. So they just, instead of taking those cows out of production to be able to, allow them to have the medications and get well, they just wouldn't. And these cows would, the mastitis or whatever infection they were facing would just get worse. The illnesses got worse and worse. And I had a vet tell me that he saw cows with the most advanced stages of mastitis in extreme pain at milking on organic dairy farms like he had never seen in the past before there was organic certification. So here's a situation where, it can be even worse and the cows can suffer even more under a humane, supposedly humane label like organic.
Hmm. Yeah, no, that's really interesting. Um, yeah, I think I mean all this labeling is maybe part of the reason why it's effective for agricultural marketers is that it's confusing. It all just seems good,
Yeah.
or something like that. And organic, I mean, I guess when one hears organic, one assumes that the organic products one will eat will be healthier, but also that the animals would have been in many respects treated better, like they're eating higher quality feed or something like that.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
yeah, as you point out, here's this huge welfare related problem
Yeah.
with yeah.
Yeah, and and I want to just say something about organic. I do feel that the organic standards with plant farming is great. I mean, I'm not against organic across the board. I think that it's actually one of the only labels that I examine, with other labels like free range and sustainable and things like that, that have zero regulation, zero oversight. Organic does have some regulation. There's actually extensive regulation, actual on-site inspection of the farms, people coming out and testing the soil and things like that. So there are environmental benefits to
Mhm.
organic, and they do feed. One of the regulations with animals is that they feed them organic feed. So there is an environmental benefit there. However, when it comes to the ethics, the experience of the animals, most of the organic labeling is so industry friendly. For example, they say that certain species of animals have to have access to the outside, right? Not all species, not across the board, but some, like cows, have to have access to the outside. Well, that's very industry friendly. Cows are often outside. They move the cows from the milking parlor to this area to that area. It's not uncommon for even the worst, the most large scale to have the cows be outside.
Right.
Now, chickens, they are very rarely outside. It is very easy to hide a chicken. The chicken industry, it's very easy for chickens to be just in one building their entire lives. And so the organic standards, the chickens don't have to have access to the outside. So it's basically just already what the industry does. So again, very little changes, so it's very deceptive, very deceptive.
Mhm. Okay, yeah, thanks. Well, so you've already answered this a little bit, but I would like to ask the question anyways. And so I know that you sometimes get this objection. The objection is something like, why are you choosing to focus your advocacy on smaller scale farms instead of industrial farms, since industrial farms contain many more animals? I was hoping you would answer this objection for us explicitly, I guess.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, it's definitely something that comes up with my work with the Humane Hoax Project, the book and the larger project. People will say, "Well, why are you focusing on just a small number of animals on small farms? People that are trying to do it better, And there's a couple of things going on. One is that, and I mentioned it before, big ag uses the humane hoax all the time,
Mm,
and people don't know it. When you're buying a product that has American Certified Humane or organic or something, some label on it, that does not necessarily mean that that animal was on a small farm. Not at all. Big industrial farms with tens of thousands of animals are using these labels. So we're not talking about a small number of animals on small farms. Another example, I gave the example of butterball turkey. Another example that I have in my book, I believe it's in the introduction, is around Fairlife Dairy. And Fairlife Dairy is a dairy that's come out just more recently, a company that's come out more recently that is kind of in response to the concerns, and they're saying, hey, we're going to give our cows a fair life, right, a better life. And Fairlife Dairy actually is huge. They have hundreds of farms across the U.S. that they supply that supplies their dairy. And there was an undercover investigation of one of their farms, and the video. This was in 2019 that this farm was investigated that supplies to Fairlife Dairy, and it was really really tough to watch the video footage. Not only were there the inherent cruelties of taking the babies, dragging these newborn babies from the mothers, but then there was added cruelty of the calves being kicked and punched and brutalized in horrible ways, dragged by tractors, and it's very very tough footage to watch. This is a dairy that supplies across the US. Fairlife Dairy is huge. So we're not talking about just small farms and a few animals. It's huge. The other part of that is that, and this gets kind of into what you were talking about with the more kind of larger picture of it, or the psychology around it. There's something that's called the psychological refuge effect, where consumers can, feel better, have a false sense of security around these labels, and think that, they see these labels, they see there's more of these labels. So they think, oh, well, the industry's improving, the industry's changing. Things are getting better for the animals. They have this sense of appeasement, when that's not the reality. The reality is that things are just getting worse for the animals, and the farms are just getting bigger. So there's a lot going on there, and that's all for all these reasons we need to address the humane hoax and expose the humane hoax.
Okay, great. Thanks. Well, so one of your book's claims is that uh, even if some farms, and maybe these farms are just hypothetical farms, but even if some farms are significantly less harmful to animals than industrial farms are, such farming operations are just not scalable. I was hoping that you would explain this claim and why it's an important one.
Yeah, so this is where we kind of get into greenwashing
Mm.
and the environmental impact. And there's a fantastic section in my book all on greenwashing, and there's extensive endnotes at the end of the book, just pages and pages of endnotes, and they mostly relate to this section of the book, with a few chapters on the environmental impact, because these authors did an amazing job of digging into the science and doing great, great studies, or citing wonderful studies around the science and the environmental impact. And scalability is really one of the big issues here. These like I was saying, one of the main things that is changing. One of the main things that's changing is the size of the confinement, right? And so there's cage free, free range, pasture raised, and when you're starting to get into those labels, well, first of all, like I said before, all those labels are unregulated. It's the farmer's own word, basically. The farmer, fills out a form, sends it in to the FDA, the USDA, whoever's going to award them this label, and it's a revolving door. Nobody gets rejected. There's no on-site inspection. Nobody knows what's really going on that farm. Everyone gets awarded these labels. So there's that, just keeping that in mind. And so with a label like free range, it doesn't necessarily mean really any change at all, and that there's any improvement, either ethically or environmentally. And most of the time, it's just a cage-free operation with a little. I've seen this with my own investigations, maybe a little concrete patio or a muddy patio that the doors open a couple hours of the day, and it's so unappealing that no bird even wants to go out there, right? So a lot of times it's just these labels mean nothing. But okay, let's give them the the benefit of the doubt for a truly free range system, which is rare, but it is happening. Some animals they're getting the animals out of the barns and out onto pasture, in chicken farming, pig farming for pork. And so, now the animals have somewhat of a bit more space, some kind of adequate, maybe outdoor space. Okay. So now we're using the same amount of animals and several more acres of land. Going back to that chicken building, right? That's maybe a quarter acre of land that this building is on with thousands of birds crammed into the building. Now, let's say that farmer wanted to actually truly free range those birds. You would need acres and acres more space. So, free ranging all those animals. And then if you get into the larger animals, pigs and cows, now we're talking about millions more acres than we're using now. So we're going to have to be destroying wild areas, cutting forests, prairies, filling wetlands to accommodate all these free range local animals, right? It's been estimated actually that we would need closer to 5 planet Earths if we wanted to free range all the animals that we have in confinement right now. It simply can't be done. We don't have enough land. Free ranging animals for food can never be more than a specialty market for a few elite buyers. It just can't be scaled up to feed now 8 billion people on the planet. And I'd like to say something else too about getting the animals out onto pasture or out. There's this romanticized notion, right, that if we just get the animals out of the confinement buildings and onto pasture, that all the problems are going to be solved, right? This. It's just not the reality. These are domesticated animals. These are not wild animals. And there's just a myriad of problems that free ranging animals actually creates new problems. Like we were talking about new and unique issues with you doing something different, doing a little improvement here and there, getting animals out onto pasture. This creates new problems for the animals that the animals face, not only the environmental issue that I just talked about, but the animals themselves. So there was a fantastic meta-analysis, and the very first chapter of my book talks about this. It looked into numerous studies around organic and free-range pork operations between 2000 2020. So it was a meta-analysis. It looked into 20 years of studies, and it found that pigs had exposure to extreme temperatures, heat stress, not being able to get adequate shade. The lighter colored animals, the skin, they would get painful sunburns, blistering. And then in the winter, extreme cold created frostbite. Piglets were dying of hypothermia and pneumonia. When they're out on pasture, they're more vulnerable to predators and have more contact with wildlife and pathogens. Of course, we're seeing the avian flu epidemic, and that would just exacerbate anything like that. So there's a complexity of problems that occur when we have animals out on pasture. It's not as simple as just putting the animals out there and thinking everything's going to be okay. The very first chapter is really wonderful and talks about this. The first chapter of the book is called A Pig Called Silver by Ingrid Taylor. And she writes about her experience growing up on a small scale pig farm. So it's a really wonderful chapter. And she gets into a lot of this stuff. So really powerful stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, I think some of what you were saying there speaks to the mistake that people sometimes make about what they perceive to be natural. So I guess a lot of people are tempted to think that if an animal is leading a life that strikes one as more natural for the animal and less artificial, less fabricated by human convention or human uses or whatever, must therefore be a better one. but that's yeah, no.
Yeah, yeah.
No, it's not
Yeah,
true.
that's the naturalistic fallacy.
Yeah.
Yeah, we think that just because it's natural, it's better, and that's certainly not the case. And there's so many examples of that. But yeah, we and and that's it's an interesting point because we have this kind of I was talking about the romanticized notion of getting animals out to pasture. We also have this kind of romance around getting back to nature with farming, and if it was all just more hands on and we smaller scale, all these things, like we have this notion that farming of the past was somehow better. But there is so much good work that's been done, good scholarship, like from Carol Adams and Karen Davis, the late Karen Davis, talking about how, farming of the past was just as brutal and had horrible practices. They did terrible things
Mm,
to animals in the past. I won't get into details, but we need to, I think, get out of this notion that that if it's just smaller scale, if it's just not as industrial, if it's not, a factory farm, that it's going to be better. But anytime you commodify an animal, anytime you are, slaughtering an animal for their flesh or commodifying an animal for their bodily fluids, there's going to be cruelty, there's going to be abuse. It cannot be avoided.
mhm,
Really, the only humane option is vegan.
yeah, right. Um, well, yeah, thanks.
Yeah.
Um, So look, a significant portion of your book discusses the labels and terminology that animal agriculture uses to humane wash and to greenwash its products. Among other things, your book's contributors indicate that such language embodies the Orwellian concept of doublespeak, as well as Carol Adams' concept of the absent referent. I was hoping that you would say something about these concepts, the ones I mentioned, but also just more generally about the labels and terminology that your book discusses.
Yeah. Yeah, language, it's so important, the language that we use around animals. It tells us so much about our relationship with them. And I talk a lot about speciesism on my podcast and in the book, and I think speciesism around language is so
Mhm,
important. Of course, just a reminder that speciesism is, of course, just like other isms, the false sense that one species is dominant over another or is more important than another. And in the book, I cite a survey by the Sentience Institute,
mhm,
and they found they asked consumers that ate meat, dairy, and eggs. They asked them about how they felt about it, and one thing they found was that 58% of the people they surveyed think that farmed animals are treated well, and 75% believe that the products that they purchase come from animals that are treated humanely. And it's just so shocking because that is not the case, not the reality. And I really believe that the presence of these alternative labels
mhm,
in the market is exacerbating this effect, that these labels are appeasing consumers in this false sense, like I've said, that there's an industry-wide improvement toward better conditions for animals, when in reality none exists. It's just getting worse. But these labels, have these images of happy cows and reassuring words. So, they think it's a trend throughout the industry. So again, that psychological refuge effect that I was talking about comes from the language of
mhm,
the labels, the language that's on the websites, incorrectly assuming that we're eating ethically produced food. It's just so important. And we compartmentalize animals into categories, right?
mhm,
There's wild animals, pets, food animals. And language really helps to shape that speciesist language, where we put animals into different camps for different uses. And even though all these animals, of course, feel the same pain, feel the same, have the same emotion, right? But the industry uses this language to manipulate and weave narratives that comforts consumers and shoppers into feeling that farmed animals that's what they're used for, right? That is their use. There's a fantastic chapter actually in the book by Devanatha Nair, who it's called "Corrupting the Language of Animal Welfare." And I'll just give you a quote here.
Sure.
It's also the crafty use of language in the stories that we tell ourselves that allows us to fawn over an animal at the zoo and still be able to consume other animals a few moments later for lunch without raising too many existential qualms. And there that gets into that absent referent where the animals at the zoo are different from the animals consumed. The animals that are consumed are absent, are just an object. They're just the meat, the flesh, right? Really fascinating stuff. But there's this a really interesting new label that I want to talk about. This label that I'm seeing more and more, because now, the cage free range has been out for a decade and they're getting more kind of passe, also getting debunked, by vegans and others. So now we're seeing new labels coming out, and one that I've seen recently is responsibly raised. Responsibly raised. And this is Whole Foods is using this, Chipotle's is using this. And this one's it's so interesting to me because, what does that mean? Responsibly raised. I mean, do they mean ethically? Do they mean environmentally? It's sufficiently vague that it could mean really just whatever you want it to mean, right? Whatever your concerns are, well, we've covered them with responsibly raised. And Chipotle's had another ad, an ad recently that had a picture of a burrito. It had this image of a burrito, and it said responsibly raised and unconditionally loved. And wow, so now we're getting into some really, when I talk about Orwellian double speak stuff. I mean, this is getting very, very warped, right? Because, of course, we're not saying that the burrito was unconditionally loved. Obviously, they're talking about the animal whose flesh has been, cut up inside the burrito. And people have no idea that the reality for this animal is essentially unchanged. Right. I mean, there's still separation of families. There's still painful body mutilations. They're still slaughtered at a young age. And these labels mean so little, but here's these comforting words, right? This reassurance that it just makes us feel better about the whole gruesome, endeavor, right, of killing animals. And there's a great chapter in the book by John Sanbonmatsu where he talks about this phenomenon of the fimivore. That's what the New York Times has dubbed this genre of literature, the fimivores, wealthy white women who have gone and bought land. They've kind of eschewed corporate life, gone and bought land, and are farming animals in a way to reclaim. It's like a feminist reclaiming of a male space, very male dominated space of animal farming and domination over animals and rodeo and those kinds of things that are very male dominated. So it's kind of a reclaiming of a male space for women, but they do it in a more, like, the language is very mothering and caregiving, right? So there's all this kind of loving, flowery language around the care that they're giving these animals, except for, that one bad day, as Carol Adams, her chapter is called, which is, around killing the animal. And sometimes they're sent to slaughter. Sometimes these women are killing the animals themselves. And so here we're getting into, some really cognitive dissonance, contradiction of, I mean, just how on earth can you say that someone that you are killing, that you are sending to a slaughterhouse, that you're causing the death of this sentient being in their youth, just months or years old, saying that that animal was unconditionally loved? It's wow. It's really bizarre stuff. But Carol Adams' chapter is really, if I could just talk about that briefly, her chapter is amazing. She is, of course, Carol Adams is a longtime vegan feminist and writer and activist. And her chapter in the book is called One Bad Day. It's a very short but very powerful chapter. And, we often hear this from farmers and others. Oh, well, if it's a small scale or humane farm, then they just have one bad day, the day they go to the slaughterhouse or whatever. And of course, Carol gets into the reality of how farmed animals endure numerous bad days. There's the day they're castrated, or the day they're debeaked, or the day that their baby is dragged from them at birth, or when a dear friend disappears forever. I mean, on and on. There are numerous bad days, no matter the label. And I like also at the end of her piece, she kind of calls out this idea of the one bad day concept, saying that a bad day is really more like stubbing your toe or spilling coffee in the car, right? It's not the frightening or brutal end of your life. And it also implies that you're going to have more days ahead, more better days to look back and say, oh, this one bad day. So it really trivializes, the brutal reality of taking an animal's life. Really interesting stuff. So that's a great article in the book. And yeah, so.
Mhm. Yeah, thanks for all those examples. It's nice to have specific examples when talking about this sort of thing. Makes it easier to understand, I think.
Yeah.
Um, well, look, so yeah, the last section of your book explores how the humane hoax is sometimes connected to religion. I was hoping that you would explain the connection to us.
Sure. Yeah, so there's a couple chapters at the end that where I relate the humane hoax to spirituality, and I also talk about it a bit in my chapter. I consider myself a spiritual person. For a long time, I felt that veganism was my spiritual expression. I still do. I consider myself a spiritual vegan. But I discovered along the way the Eastern traditions, particularly the Jain religion. Jains are one of the Dharma traditions out of India, along with Hinduism and Buddhism. And all three of these religions have the concept of ahimsa, which means nonviolence or non-harming. It's a Sanskrit word. And interestingly, they all feel that compassion is very important as well, all of these Dharma traditions. Karuna is the Sanskrit word for compassion. But ahimsa, non harming, especially to the Jains, is the highest principle, is the most important. Non harming is what we should really be focusing on, really meditating on in all that you do, your actions, and even in your words and your thoughts. And the reason that ahimsa is even more important than compassion, karuna, is that it's action oriented. It's an action to do no harm, right? It's kind of an action to not do harm, which is interesting. But just having compassion's not enough, right? You have to stop your harmful actions. And I really resonated with that. I love that concept, and I love the Jain tradition so much. And one of the chapters in that section is written by Dr. Christopher Jane Miller. He talks about this concept, the connection with the Jains and veganism, and how the Jains are seeing veganism really as a modern expression of their deepest held belief of ahimsa that
Mhm.
they cultivated thousands of years ago. So really interesting connections there. Another chapter in that section is by my husband, Kojan Bohanec. He's a scholar and professor in the Dharma traditions. And his chapter is really interesting. It's around spiritual bypass and this new trend of do-it-yourself slaughter. I mentioned it at the beginning, and it is kind of an aspect of the humane hoax. And there's now actually workshops that you can take to learn how to slaughter animals, how to do it yourself. And I do believe that some people going into this are going into it with good intentions, right? They're trying to get out of the industrial food system. They want to do it better. So there's something admirable there, but the reality of taking another animal's life, another sentient being's life, That's and I think that they get that too sometimes, to a degree. Like, it's just so intense, and because of that they start to use very kind of spiritual language around this, right? And in the Dharma traditions, I'll just say too that taking another animal's life, there is no greater sin, for lack of a better word. That's a more kind of Western concept, but there's no more harmful action that you can take than to take another animal's life, human animal or non-human animal. And that's another reason why I love the Dharma traditions so much. But getting back to these workshops, right? So the instructors will often use very spiritual language to describe the act of slaughter. They'll say things like that they're going to pray over the animals, or they're going to release the animal's soul or spirit, right? But this is spiritual bypass, where you use spirituality to justify doing horrible things. And that's what Kojin's chapter is about. It's really fascinating. He kind of dives into the psychology, the psychological manipulation and twisting that has to go on to defend these terrible acts. So there's some really, really interesting takes on the humane hoax just throughout the
Hmm.
book.
Okay, yeah, thanks. Yeah, I know the religion section was one of the shorter sections in the book. I guess it was the shortest one.
Yeah.
But I did find it interesting. I guess I mean, so as you pointed out yourself, sometimes religion can motivate positive behavior. A consistent commitment to ahimsa would lead to veganism, and for people who are motivated by that consideration to become vegan, religion was a very positive thing. But religion can also be used to rationalize killing, as you pointed out. So it can go in both directions.
Yep.
Sometimes depending on the religion, maybe a little bit, but also even within the same religion. I imagine. I imagine there are some commitments within Christianity or monotheism or whatever, which would lead one maybe to go vegan, and then other things in it that could lead one in another direction or whatever. It's complicated, I imagine.
Yeah, yeah.
Um,
Well,
yeah,
religion's a tool, just like a
yeah,
knife. You can use it for many different things.
yeah,
And this is how someone uses it. Yeah,
yeah, right. And with respect to do-it-yourself slaughter, I know that that was the focus of your brother's chapter.
it's
And
my
the
husband.
oh, sorry, your husband. Sorry,
Mhm.
right.
Yeah,
Well, yeah, okay. I shared last name. I had to be a family member. Yeah,
yep, yeah.
sorry, you mentioned it was your husband.
Close.
Um, but yeah, the so I mean, in the chapter, it's about rationalizing do-it-yourself slaughter via the use of religion, like psychologically rationalizing it for yourself. But I mean, do-it-yourself slaughter is discussed in other parts of the book too, and often it was one of these examples where often it can go quite a bit worse than if it hadn't happened in the first place. So do-it-yourself slaughter gets botched really regularly, I think was something that was found in some of the studies that you and the other authors looked at. Like botched do-it-yourself slaughters is very common.
Yep.
And I think also so this is where things get kind of complicated. Sometimes do-it-yourself slaughter can remove the need for live transport, but it doesn't always do that. I don't think. Can you let me know what am I am I remembering something
Yeah,
that was
yeah.
useful here? Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, sure. So that is one of the claims that, because transport is horrible, absolutely. And and transporting, the animals get transported, numerous times throughout their lives. And transport, they're crammed into these, you see them on the highway, these transport trucks where the pigs or cows are just crammed in there on top of one another. And these can be long journeys for hours and hours without food, without water, in all temperatures. So, so transport is horrible. And so this is one of the claims of some small scale farming and humane farming, is that they slaughter the animals on site. And this is very rare. I mean, it's it's very, very rare to have access to a product, a meat product that actually does this, but some do. But, with these on-site slaughterings, so there's numerous different ways the farmers can just do it themselves, or they can have a slaughtering unit, like a trailer, come and do the slaughtering. They'll hire someone to come in. The slaughtering process doesn't change. I mean, that it's still throat slitting, where the animal bleeds out for sometimes, minutes. It can take up to 2 minutes. And that is an agonizing amount of time to be writhing in pain and gasping for your life. So, it's still a horrifying slaughter, no matter where it's done. Doesn't matter if it's at the slaughterhouse or on the farm. And like you said, when it's not, and it happens in the slaughterhouse too. Botched slaughters, basically, where the slaughter isn't, the animal is not killed within just a minute or two, that actually, it doesn't go, the knife doesn't go deep enough, or, it's all very gruesome. But the animal can sometimes linger in pain for minutes or longer. I mean, sometimes it takes a great deal of effort to kill these animals, and you have to go to great lengths. I don't want to get into too much detail because it is gruesome. It's awful. In my first book, actually, The Ultimate Betrayal, I pulled quotes from blogs from do-it-yourself slaughtering, people that were doing it themselves and decided, I'm going to kill this rabbit myself and be more humane and environmental and all of that, right? And had no idea how difficult it can be to actually kill an animal, and had to, struggle and fight with this poor animal fighting for his or her life. So, yeah, people don't realize just how gruesome the process is, and that the animals will fight for their lives and they don't want to die.
So look, we've taken up a lot of your time. I'd like to thank you again for joining us to talk about your book, The Humane Hoax: Essays Exposing the Myth of Happy Meat, Humane Dairy, and Ethical Eggs. As I mentioned before, your book was published in 2023 by Lantern Publishing and Media. The only other question that I have for you is whether you're currently working on any projects, and if so, what are they?
Well, I do have my ongoing Humane Hoax project. Humanehoax.org is the website. And we have a dedicated volunteer team, and we're going to be having upcoming conferences, but nothing right coming up this year. But we do have over just so many wonderful videos from our past conferences that can be viewed on our YouTube page, Compassionate Living's YouTube page, my nonprofit Compassionate Living. And for those that are interested in spiritual veganism, I am going to be starting a monthly ongoing spiritual vegan gathering. It's going to be called the Ahimsa, what is it called? The Ahimsa Living Circle. That's it, the Ahimsa Living Circle. So if you're interested in that, let me know so I can get you on the list so you could hear more about that. It's in collaboration with Arihanta Institute, which is a online Jain college. And yeah, so it's, I have stuff coming up. Be sure to sign up on Compassionate Living's e-news list so you'll hear what we have. And I just wanted to give one last thought, kind of a positive last thought. And that is that, even though I speak out against the humane labels, and I'm, very frustrated with it all, I do think that it's a positive progression. I think that, why do people seek out these labels, right? It's because they care. They care about animals. They don't want to see animals suffer. So I think that's really hopeful. And I think this is just a stage that we have to go through to get to our, the logical conclusion of treating animals humanely is that we don't kill them. And I believe we'll get there, but we can't be complacent and think that people are going to get there on their own, because the marketing and the labels are lying to them. So we have to be a voice for the truth, tell the animal stories. And I really believe that most people don't want to support animal suffering. And it's only a matter of time before we have the just, compassionate vegan world that we all want. So I really hope that this book reaches them and helps in that progress. And yeah.
Well, that's a wonderful thought to finish the interview with. Thanks again for joining us, Hope.
Thank you.